Okay, hi everybody. Welcome. My name is Adam Late. I'm the chair of the philosophy department. It is my pleasure today to introduce this year's annual Bo and Lynn Clark Memorial Lecture. And I want to start telling you a bit about Romaine Clark, who was known as Bo. Bo received his bachelor's and PhD degrees in philosophy from the State University of Iowa, where he was a student from the mid-1940s until 1952, when the Iowa faculty included Gustav Bergman, Wilfrid Sellers, and Everett Hall, among others. Bo's first faculty position was at Duke University, and in 1970, he moved to IU, where he remained until his retirement in 1991. He served as chair of the IU philosophy department from 1972 to 1974. Bo Clark was interested in the nature of perception, the structure of natural language, and the nature of common patterns of inference in everyday reasoning. His work was well respected, as is shown in part by the prestigious fellowships and grants that he received, including an NEH fellowship and grants from the Fulbright Foundation and the NSF. He was a dedicated teacher who supervised many PhD dissertations. He was also widely admired and respected by his colleagues. Paul Spade, who was Bo's colleague in the IU philosophy department for 20 years, and who himself just recently retired, many of you know him. Paul Spade wrote in 2008 that, quote, Bo was an acute philosopher and one of the few philosophers I've known whose work everyone who knew him respected. No one thought he was crazy, pursuing marginal and uninteresting topics, or that he did sloppy or question-begging work. He always asked the most penetrating questions in departmental colloquia and papers, ones that clarified for everyone and went right to the heart of the matter. He was also a man of utmost honesty and just plain good sense. Bo and his wife Lynn had 4 children, Carolee Hawkins and Kathleen, John, and Ron Clark. They have given generously money to the IU philosophy department in memory of their parents, both to fund the annual Bo and Lynn Clark lectures and also to fund 3 annual prizes for philosophy graduate students, 2 for excellence in philosophical writing and 1 for excellence in teaching. We are extremely thankful for their continuing support of the IU philosophy department. And when I wrote to express gratitude this spring, Ron wrote back that he was sorry that he couldn't be here with us today. So today's Clark Memorial Lecturer is Professor Lara Buchak, who comes to us from Princeton University. Professor Buchak received her PhD from Princeton in 2009 and spent 12 years at UC Berkeley before returning to Princeton. I have to say, I appreciated the Go Bears on your webpage. Since I was a Berkeley undergrad, right. I was glad you still had that loyalty, even despite moving back to your alma mater. Her 2013 book, Risk and Rationality, concerns how an individual ought to take risk into account when making decisions. And she argues that individuals with differing attitudes towards risk can all be rational. Her research interests have spread out from decision theory to include publications in social choice theory, epistemology, ethics, and the philosophy of religion. And today she will be talking on faith and rational deference to authority. So please join me in welcoming Lara Buchak.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you for saying my name correctly in the introduction. And also Go Bears. Okay, so elsewhere, I've argued for an account of what it means to have faith in a claim. A rough account is that if you have faith in a claim, you're willing to take a risk on it without looking for more evidence, and you're willing to remain committed to taking this risk, even if you get evidence to the contrary. That's the view I've argued for. There's this other competing view of faith. It's historically popular. And this is, by the way, faith both in a sort of religious sense and a mundane sense. There's this other view that's historically popular, and that's the idea that to have faith in something or someone means to trust their testimony or trust that the thing they're saying is true. So two things I want to do today. First, I actually want to argue that these are not competing accounts, that this account of this testimony account of faith is actually a special case of my account, my risky commitment account of faith. Second, there are two debates in the philosophy of testimony that I'm interested in speaking to. One is there's this question of whether it's ever a good idea, rational, moral, what have you, to farm out your beliefs or your actions to someone else. Could it ever be rational to like do something even though your own best reasoning says you shouldn't? Or could it ever be rational to believe something even though your own best reasoning tells against it? And second is taking someone's testimony into account. Is that just another sort of, do you treat it as just another piece of evidence, or do you something special? And I want to resolve these debates by answering yes to both questions. Yes, sometimes it can be rational to take someone else's word for it, even though your best reasoning tells to the contrary. And trusting testimony is more than just sort of taking testimony into account as a piece of evidence. All right, so let me begin by roughly outlining my account of faith and why faith in this sense is rational. Rational both in sort of a belief sense and an action sense. Okay, so first of all, just sort of cordon off what we're talking about. We are talking about both religious and mundane faith. We're talking about faith that some claim is true rather than faith in a person or a thing, although you might think that faith in reduces to faith that. And finally, not every claim will be a potential object for faith. So in order for a claim to be an object, for you to have faith in it or not have faith in it or lack faith in it, a couple of things have to hold. You have to have a positive attitude towards this claim. For example, it doesn't make sense to say, I have faith that you won't quit smoking, since like that's something I don't like. Second, you have to not be certain whether it holds on the basis of evidence alone. You can't, for example, say, I have faith that 1 + 1 = 2. Or if you say that, it sort of evokes the idea that like, maybe we're not sure. Maybe we're in some philosophy classroom where we're questioning that or something. Okay. So once you're an object of faith, here's what once a claim is an object of faith, here is what it takes to have faith. So to have faith in a claim is to be willing to commit to taking risks on that claim without regard for additional evidence, and to be willing to follow through on taking those risks, even if you get evidence against the truth of the claim. So for example, if you have faith that a friend will keep your secrets, you're willing to take the risk of confiding in her, something that's good if she keeps your secret and bad if she doesn't. And you're willing to do that without first asking a third party if you think the friend is trustworthy. Furthermore, if someone came to you and said, I think your friend is not very trustworthy, you tell her your secret. That's like what it takes to have faith. Or similarly, if you have faith that a colleague wouldn't try to embezzle given the opportunity, you take the risk of leaving him alone with the money. You don't sort of like, if money goes missing, you continue to believe that your colleague is trustworthy. You don't blame it for money. For a religious example, since Moses has faith in God, he's willing to follow God's commands to lead his people out of Egypt, even when it looks like Pharaoh won't let them. So even when he gets evidence that this is like not going to be successful, but in fact, he'll die or something. And while they're in the desert, if God's people have faith that there will be manna to gather each morning, they'll refrain from storing it for the next day. It's something the Israelites do as they're wandering through the desert. Even if it sort of seems implausible that food will come from heaven again tomorrow. Okay, so those are some examples. Couple things to note. One is that faith comes in degrees in two ways. One is in terms of the degree of risk you're willing to take. And two is in terms of the degree of additional evidence that you're willing to like withstand. So if Moses has a very high degree of faith, he's willing to take a very big risk. And he's also willing to withstand like a lot of evidence that Pharaoh isn't going to let us, that he's not consistent. And second, strictly speaking, having faith is compatible with looking for more evidence, as long as you're not looking for more evidence in order to decide what to do. So consider, for example, the religious apologist who looks for more evidence to convince other people that the religion is true. That person has faith, but they're compatible with my account here because they're not basing their decision to attend religious services on what their future evidence reveals. Okay. That's what it takes to have faith in a claim. And I've also shown using decision theory when and why this kind of faith is rational. So we're not going to go through the argument in detail, but I just want to kind of give you the basis. My opinion about formal work is that in any case, you should be able to translate it back into ordinary language and it should still ring true. So the point of this isn't the math and the numbers. The point is let's illuminate some phenomenon that we then think, hey, actually, look, that's true. Okay, so here's the rough argument. Assume an individual has credences, that is subjective probabilities in various claims. Also assume that she maximizes expected utility. Now she faces a choice between two actions, one of which is a risk on some claim, in the sense that it'll turn out better if the claim is true and worse if the claim is false, and the other is not a risk. So for example, on your handout, Moses faces the choice, should I lead my people out of Egypt? Leading them out is a risk on the basis of the claim that leading would be a success. Let's just assign a value 1 to leading the people out of Egypt if it would be successful, and 0 if it's a failure, and some middle value m, maybe 0.75, 0.5, 0.25, what have you, if they stay in Egypt. Okay. So the question of whether Moses should not just lead his people out of Egypt, but in fact, commit to doing that without looking for further evidence and remain committed, even if evidence tells to the contrary, is answered by looking at what Moses should do in the two decisions with the following payout. So first, should I commit or should I look for more evidence and then decide? So committing has the following payouts. If it sort of doesn't depend on what the evidence says, right? That's what it is to commit. So if leading people out of Egypt would be a success, Moses gets a payout of 1 plus whatever benefits, if any, of committing to lead your people out of Egypt, not just in fact doing it. If the thing's a failure, you get 0. On the other hand, looking for evidence and then deciding makes the act and thus the payoffs depend on what the evidence says. So if the evidence tells in favor of him leading his people out of Egypt, he'll lead them out of Egypt. And then if it's a success, he gets 1, and if it's a failure, he gets 0. On the other hand, if evidence tells against leading his people out of Egypt, he'll stay in Egypt, he'll get the middling payoff, no matter what. Okay, so that's the first question he has to ask himself. And to sort of look at the conditions under which committing is better than looking for more evidence and then deciding, we can sort of just say what the advantages are of committing versus waiting, and then just how likely each of these advantages are to come to pass, and sort of put it all together to say when committing is better. So the advantages of committing are, 1, that he gets, if in fact he leads his people out and it's a success, he gets the benefit of having committed to that rather than just doing it. And if the evidence is misleading, he gets evidence that it wouldn't work, but in fact it would work. He gets the payoff of leading his people out of Egypt rather than staying there. So that's in the third column. On the other hand, the benefit of waiting to look at the evidence and then decide is that if he gets negative evidence and it leads him in the correctest direction, he's really actually not going to make it out of Egypt, then he gets the middling payoff rather than a failure payoff. So we then just ask, what are the various probabilities of these benefits of each action have to be in order for committing to be better than looking for evidence and deciding. And similarly, We can ask about when is it going to be a good idea to remain committed, even if Moses commits and then gets evidence to the contrary. The payoffs for remaining committed are going to be 1 plus the commitment if he's a success, and the failure payoff 0 if he's a failure. On the other hand, you could back out and get the middling payoff minus whatever cost of backing out. Maybe he started leading his people out of Egypt. Okay. So that's just sort of like the rough setup. Here are the conditions under which the first action in each chart is like the better one. And I'll sort of just say what they are and then I'll like explain why. So first condition, the probability that the claim is true is sufficiently high. The probability of Moses being successful is already sufficiently high before he looks for the evidence. Second, even if he gets negative evidence, it's not going to be conclusive. Evidence against the claim in question, if it appears, it won't put him into a state in which he thinks definitely leading my people out of Egypt will fail. It'll put him into a state where he's like, I don't know, could succeed, could fail. And finally, there are benefits to be gained from committing to taking a risk on X if X holds, rather than just taking a risk on it. So there's some sort of special benefit to commit. So why are these the conditions under which the sort of like first choice in each of the chart are better? Well, if the probability of X is sufficiently high, then we're going to care a lot about this first column, positive evidence and success, for example, and how each action does there. If the probability of X given negative evidence is also pretty high, then the possibility of the evidence is going to be misleading is like just as salient as the possibility that it's going to be correct and not to be actually. So in general, the reason it's a good idea for Moses to commit is because he's in a situation in which even if he gets evidence to the contrary, that evidence has like a pretty good chance of just making him do the wrong thing. It has a pretty good chance of making him back out of something that would have been successful. Okay, so we might say faith keeps us from being blown about by the changing winds of evidence. It keeps us from being blown about by evidence to the contrary. It also keeps us from like dithering, from not reaping the benefits of just making a decision now or committing now. Okay, and we can also sort of think about how things go. I mean, so these conditions are especially going to hold when you're involved in what we might call a long-term project, where evidence tends to go up and down. So I was talking to some of the grad students at lunch, just thinking about the decision to start graduate school. So usually when you start graduate school, you have like a pretty high probability that you'll succeed in graduate school. You've done a good job at undergrad. You've all these like great letters of recommendation and so forth. So you meet the first condition. But here's what often happens in graduate school. Sometimes you get evidence that you will in fact succeed. Sometimes you get evidence that that you will fail. So you take your first seminar and get a bad grade on your first paper. Oh no, your probability drops. And then you take another seminar and you elucidate some brilliant idea. Your probability goes up, and then something else happens and it drops. So like there are all these situations in which the nature of the thing is that you need to commit over a long period of time to make it happen. But the evidence about whether this will be successful goes like this. So the only way for you to make it through, if you do have the possibility of being successful, is to not tie your action to the evidence you have at the time. The only way to make it through is to actually commit. So thinking about like Moses, here's what happens in that story. He thinks, all right, Pharaoh's going to let my people leave Egypt. So he starts to go. And then Pharaoh says, like, actually, change my mind. Come on back. And then in the story, God sends a plague. And then Pharaoh says, all right, I'll let you go. And then Moses gets ready to go. And Pharaoh says, never mind, I've changed my mind. And then God sends another plague and so forth. So what happens to Moses' evidence is it keeps going like this in terms of whether he's going to succeed. So if he actually can succeed, and if he actually can succeed, then his only chance of succeeding is to committing to it, rather than just going and then coming back, and going and coming back and going and coming back. Okay, so though that's the case in which it's rational to have faith. It's rational to commit to something without looking for more evidence and to retain the commitment even in the face of counter evidence. But so far, this has all been about action. So we want to know about belief. In fact, we can think of belief as a certain kind of action, a certain kind of risk. So believing some claim is a risk on that claim. For someone who cares about the truth, if X is true, it's better to believe X. And if X is false, it's better to not believe X. So believing X is better than agnosticism if X holds, and it's worse than agnosticism if X does not hold. So looking back at the chart on the first page of the handout, instead of like leading people out of Egypt and staying in Egypt, we can replace those with beliefs. Like in this case, maybe it's believing that leaving would be a success or something like that, believing that it wouldn't be a success. And M is the payoff that you would assign to agnosticism. There's a more specific account of belief that we can tie this to, and I'll just sort of like roughly describe it. So this is known as the cognitive utility account of belief. On this account, we can sort of assign utilities to beliefs based both on whether the belief is true and on how specific it is. So if you think of something like we have a presidential election, either candidate A, B, or C is going to win. If candidate A in fact wins, the best thing to believe is that candidate A wins. The second best thing to believe is that candidate A or B wins. So both things are true, but the first thing is more specific. And the worst thing to believe would be that candidate B or C wins because it's both false and unspecific. So we can sort of think of like assigning payoffs, sort of like how good are my beliefs at tracking the truth and tracking the truth in a more specific way based on what I believe and what's true. In the case of two options, you can just sort of think of like, if your belief is true, give it a 1. If it's false, give it a 0. On the other hand, if you're agnostic, get some payoff in the middle. Okay. So we can just then import these conditions about when it's good to take a risk in action to tell us when it's good to take a risk in what you believe. So it's going to be good to take a risk, namely believe some claim and remain committed to that claim, even if you get evidence to the contrary, if the conditions on the handout hold. If the probability of the thing in question is sufficiently high, if evidence to the contrary puts you in like a middling state rather than being conclusive against X, and if there are benefits to be gained from committing to believe the claim rather than just believing it. Okay. So I want to talk about this question of when is it better to commit to a belief rather than just believe. I think there are two circumstances in which this holds. One is if the claim itself concerns matters in which it's better to have an unwavering belief in the truth. So you might think, for example, if you have a trustworthy friend, it's better to all the time believe that your friend is trustworthy, if that's in fact true, than to sometimes believe it and sometimes not. You might think in the religious case, it's better to unwaveringly believe that God loves you, if that's in fact true, than to sometimes believe it and sometimes not. So maybe there are these interpersonal cases in which it's better to like always have the true belief over and above just having the true belief at every time. Second, there are benefits to committing to believe some claim if it's a claim on which a lot of reasoning is based, such as the core claims of scientific, religious, or moral traditions. So committing to some central claim of a scientific, religious, or moral tradition is going to help facilitate our reasoning, for example, by helping us figure out which sources to consult, cutting down on our cognitive load, and so forth. For example, a committed Catholic will pay more attention to Catholic sources. Maybe she'll spend less time thinking about beliefs that don't cohere with Catholicism. She'll spend a lot of time like reading authors that take Catholicism for granted and figuring out like what follows if it's true. If she instead decides to become Jewish, she'll have to consult entirely new sources and cease to pay as much attention to the Catholic one. So there are benefits to committing to some like core moral, scientific, or religious claim, and there are costs to drop it. Okay. In other words, sort of like take us back to the dialectic here. This third condition is often met in the case of beliefs when we're talking about interpersonal matters or when we're talking about core claims that are sort of deeply embedded within some domain of science, religion, or morality. So with respect to those claims, as long as you meet conditions 1 and 2, it's not only going to be rational to believe the claim, it's going to be rational to commit to believing the claim and to ignore evidence to the contrary, to continue to believe the claim even if you get evidence to the contrary. But I should note that once you commit to believing a claim, you're not stuck forever. So if, for example, your credence drops low enough, maybe you get some evidence that really is conclusive that your claim is false, then you can get rid of it. So if you think of something like deconversion in a religious case, or even in the case of scientific or moral beliefs, you're committed, and then at some point you feel like my evidence is so strongly against this thing that I drop it. So that's a sort of classic case of losing. Okay. So the sort of typical way that faith progresses, I think, you first gather enough evidence to make faith rational. So you can't have rational faith unless you first have high credence in the claim, unless you meet conditions. So you first gather enough evidence. If your faith gets high enough, or sorry, if your credence gets high enough, then it's going to be rational to commit. So for example, you would observe your new acquaintance being trustworthy before you commit to the claim that she's a good friend. Other handouts on the back table. Maybe Moses has initial interactions with God before he's willing to like commit to do whatever. Once you've gathered evidence, if it raises your credence sufficiently, then it becomes rational to commit. So commit to confiding in your friend. You commit to doing whatever God commands. Once you have the commitment, your evidence might ebb and flow. And when you have a high credence of your own, when you have a lot of evidence in favor of the claim and little to the contrary, then the faith commitment isn't going to do much work. So if if everybody's like, yeah, your friend is a good secret keeper, the faith itself isn't doing much work. You're just sort of like resting on what your credences are at the time. But when your credence is low, your faith commitment is what keeps you committed to the action. So if somebody said, your friend, not very trustworthy, then it's your faith commitment that keeps you confiding in it. Okay. And then maybe one of two things happens. Maybe you've either amassed such strong evidence that the claims don't need faith to prop them up, so that you'll never be in this like low credence situation again, or your evidence has grown so weak that you abandon it. Okay. So that is the risky commitment account of faith, of its rationality, and of like how this thing typically progresses, how people come to have faith, what faith does in their life, and then how they either come to like not need it or to drop it. Okay. So that's what I've argued about faith. But there's this alternate account of faith. And this account says that faith is belief on the basis of testimony. And this has a lot of support from a variety of both religious and philosophical traditions. And it comes in two versions. One is about practical deference, and one is about deference in terms of what you believe. So here are the two versions. First, the epistemic version of the testimonial deference account. So this says to have faith in an authority is to be willing to believe claims on the basis of the authority's testimony, even if one's own reasoning about these claims is silent or implies their falsity. And to have faith that a claim holds is to believe this claim because one has faith in an authority. Okay, so for example, I don't know, you have faith in your religious authority to tell you what's right and wrong. To have faith in this religious authority is to believe what this authority says, even if your own reasoning about this claim says like, I don't know, or implies that your religious authority is wrong. Similarly, practical version of the testimonial deference account says that to have faith in an authority is to be willing to act on the basis of the authority's claims, even if one's own reasoning about these claims is silent or implies that you shouldn't act. And to have faith that a claim holds is to act on this claim because one has faith in an entity. Okay. So I note here that your own reasoning might include the fact that the authority has testified to such and such. So having faith has to go beyond the testifier's pronouncement as just another piece of evidence to be weighed against the other evidence. So it's not a picture where like, all right, I think this, my religious authority thinks this, let's like weigh them against each other. Instead, the picture is I'm committed to believe what their religious authority says, even when I reason that they're wrong, taking into account the fact that they've said this thing. Okay. So next, I want to argue that this account, instead of being very different from my account of faith, is actually a special case of it. And then once it's a special case of it, we'll be able to import the rationality conditions from my account of faith, sort of look at when it's rational to defer to somebody's testimony rather than reason about it on your own. So according to my account, the risky commitment account, if you have faith that some testifier pronounces correctly, then you have to be willing to commit to act on the basis of his testimony, regardless of what further evidence might say. And you have to remain committed to acting even if you get evidence to the contrary. So that's just like my account applied to what happens when somebody testifies. You have to be willing to commit to act, to not look for further evidence, and to act even if you get evidence to the contrary. But one particular kind of further evidence is just what you yourself think about the matter, right? So if we plug in your own reasoning for further evidence, what my account says is that if you have faith in some testifier, then you have to be willing to take a risk on their claim without thinking it through yourself. And you have to be willing to continue to take the risk, even if you do think it through yourself and come to the contrary. Okay, so that's just a special case of my account, and that turns out to just be the testimonial deference account. So shown that this account is a special case of mine by plugging in testimonial deference for the particular faith action and plugging in my own reasoning for the particular account. Okay. So for example, if I have faith in my sense in my priest with respect to what my tradition says, but I reach a conclusion contrary to his, I follow his anyway. If Moses has faith in God, but he reasons to the conclusion that leading Egypt would be a bad idea, he leads anyway. And similarly, not just with these actions, but with believing. Okay. So risky commitment faith in an authority implies testimonial deference faith in the authority. testimonial deference is a special case of risky commitment. Okay, so once we've seen that testimonial deference is a special case of my account, we can just plug in the rationality conditions to figure out when is testimonial deference rational. So testimonial deference, contrary to what I discover when I reason through it on my own, is rational under the following conditions. And I'm just giving them names here to sort of track them. First, call it the reliability condition. My credence that the claim is true, that a claim is true, given that an authority testifies that it's true, is sufficiently high. So maybe this is true on the basis of like the authority having a particular track record. Maybe it's true on the basis of the authority having a particular credential or something like that. Second, the inconclusiveness condition. Even if I get the counter evidence, which in this case is my own reasoning, points to the contrary of what the testifier says, I'm still going to be sort of in the middle with respect to X. So the inconclusiveness condition says that the probability of X, given that the authority testifies that X and my own reasoning points to not X, is still sufficiently high. So it's not, my own reasoning isn't going to be conclusive. And finally, the situation condition. There are benefits to be gained from committing to take a risk on the claim or from taking the risk now before thinking through the matter myself if the claim holds. And these benefits couldn't merely be gained from taking the risk, and one must actually follow through on the commitment in order to get these benefits. Okay, so that's when it's rational to defer to testimony rather than to my own reasoning, and just going back to sort of like the reason for why these conditions make it rational to like retain your commitment to the authority. Again, we can think about like, what are the advantages to sticking with the authority? What are the advantages to going with your own reasoning? And like, in what proportion of cases does each advantage hold? So the advantage of going with your own reasoning is that you might be right and the authority might be wrong. So you have to think about the likelihood of that. Advantages of going with the authority might be right and you might be wrong. And also there might be some, if the authority is right, then you get whatever benefits you get from committing to the authority rather than just believing. So we have to ask how likely are those things. And the advantages over here, given their likelihood, outweigh the advantages over here, given their likelihood if we meet these three conditions. If it's very likely that the authority is correct, if it's still pretty likely that the authority is correct, even if I've reasoned to the contrary, and if there's some benefits to committing and remaining committed over and above just like believing the thing or doing. So I hope that's sort of the sort of informal analogs of these formal conditions. I hope we can see like why those would be the conditions under which we should commit to the authority. Okay. So finally, I want to look at 4 central cases in which people tend to defer to authorities rather than to their own reasoning. And I want to argue 2 things. One, people are actually rational in these cases to defer to authorities rather than their own reasoning. And 2, the fact that this like describes sort of how actual people act supports life. So like this is something that we've been doing. We're already doing this. The fact that we are already doing this with presumably like results that some people like supports that this is fake and that this is like we correctly identified the rationality conditions. Okay, so the first example is domain experts. So for example, scientists are authorities about scientific findings. Professors and teachers are authorities about the subject they teach. Doctors are authorities about their patient's health. Woodworkers are authorities about how to make furniture. Artists are authorities about how to make good art. Wine tasters are authorities about particular flavors of wine. So to treat these individuals as authorities in these domains is to defer to their pronouncements rather than to reason through the matter ourselves, and to continue to defer to them even if we do reason through the matter ourselves and reach a different conclusion. So for example, I treat my physics professor as an authority when I accept her solution to a problem as correct, even if I've tried the problem and arrived at a different solution. I treat my doctor as an authority when I do what she prescribes as a treatment for my illness, even if my own internet research suggests I should do otherwise. An apprentice woodworker treats a master woodworker as an authority when he defers to the master about like the order in which he should assemble the cabinet, even if he thinks he's found a faster way. Okay, so first claim, treating a domain expert as an authority is often or typically rational. One situation with respect to the expert satisfies the reliability, inconclusiveness, and situation condition. So first, it should be clear how experts satisfy the reliability condition, why the novice should assign high credence to their pronouncements. An expert is sort of by definition someone who has deep knowledge on a subject, whether academic or practical knowledge, and thus is someone who's likely to be correct about facts in their domain of expertise. What it is for someone to be recognized as an expert in their domain is for this fact to be acknowledged, often with some credential or title that requires they have a track record of knowledge. Okay, so this is like, that's pretty basic. What it is to recognize someone as an expert is to like think they meet the first condition. Second, the conclusiveness condition is typically satisfied. So recall that this condition states that there's still a fairly high chance of the expert being correct, even if the novice reasons through the matter herself and comes to a different conclusion than the expert. So an undergrad who reasons through a physics problem and arrives at a different solution should still think the professor is likely to be correct, even if she can't locate the professor's error. And more generally, when one gains subject matter expertise, when you gain subject matter expertise, you also gain an ability to like reason about why various answers are wrong. So novices don't know enough to know that they're making an error. So being a novice should particularly make you think the inconclusiveness condition holds, because even if you reason through the matter yourself and reason through the, even like keeping in mind the person is an expert, you kind of don't know additional errors you can make. So you can't even sort of like reason about who's correct in a fully complete manner. So you should just sort of assign this middling credence on the basis of your limited knowledge about the subject and the expert's expert knowledge. Okay. Finally, cases of treating a domain expert as an authority often meet the situation condition, which recall says that there are benefits to committing to the action or belief in question or to doing so now. So things like assembling a cabinet, taking a prescribed medical course of action can typically only be completed if the expert is correct by following the expert's advice. If you like start assembling the cabinet wrong, that's a disaster. If you like stop the treatment in the middle, when you kind of question its legitimacy, the treatment's not going to work. Less obviously, there are often benefits to committing to beliefs that domain experts profess, because doing so is often necessary to understand the subject matter. For example, the physics student who commits to holding that her professor is correct, regardless of her own reasoning, will be more apt to try to figure out her own error. She'll use the professor's result rather than her own in future problems and so forth. In fact, deferring to an expert and then like letting the expert's views guide yours, even when you disagree, is often how you become an expert yourself. Okay. So recall the typical progression of faith. First, you gather evidence, enough evidence to make faith rational. Then you develop faith and so commit to taking the risk on the claim you have faith in. Then you either amass enough evidence in favor of the claim that you don't need faith anymore, or you amass enough evidence against that you lose faith. This, as it turns out, is also the typical progression of a novice with respect to an expert. So usually the expert establishes a reliable track record. The novice sees this track record and has faith in her, so like commits to just going with what the expert thinks. If the novice is interested enough, she'll continue to seek understanding. If the expert is in fact reliable, then the novice will get enough knowledge that she doesn't need the expert anymore. And if the expert is like not, if the expert is a quack, then the novice will eventually drop her commitment. So we can sort of see like the way faith works in these practical domains, kind of also the way things work in the matter of like gaining subject matter expertise. So second kind of case, interpersonal advisors. So many people have someone to whom they defer in matters of personal conduct and decision-making, a friend, a therapist, a sponsor in a 12-step program, a priest, rabbi, imam. To treat these individuals as authorities in your personal life is to take their advice and directives, even when your own reasoning leads you to believe that they're wrong. And then in this section, I want to claim again that treating an advisor as an authority in this matter is often rational. And indeed, it would often be a mistake to have no one that you treat as an authority. So it would be a mistake in the interpersonal domain to sort of always treat your own reasoning as decisive. So you should have people to whom you think, I think X and this person thinks not X, I should go with not X. Right. So reliability condition, again, pretty straightforward. If the individual in question has a track record of wise advice in the case of family and friends, or the advisor possesses some credential that the individual takes to be indicative of a tendency to give wise advice, for example, like in a religious case, the religious figure that possesses whatever religious credential is relevant to one's religion. In the case of a therapist, they possess some credential that, like, you should think this person's likely to have a track record of wise advice. Okay, so we meet the reliability condition if we have some reason to think this interpersonal advisor has a good track record. Now, what about the inconclusiveness condition? This again is the condition that says advisor says X, I say not X, still X is fairly likely to be true. This condition is particularly apt to be satisfied in certain matters. First, matters on which the individual is like a novice and the advisor is an expert. Things like, I don't know, the individual is like just starting out in graduate school or just embarking on a new marriage, and the advisor has like expertise. They went through graduate school themselves. They've been married for 20 years successfully. So that's sort of one kind of case, but I think maybe even a more interesting case is matters on which one is apt to engage in motivated reasoning to conclude that it's morally permissible to do A when in fact A is impermissible. So we might sort of think temptation doesn't operate merely by making an immoral action hard to resist. Instead, it operates by clouding your judgment. So if you've ever sort of like seen a person that is engaged in some immoral action, they don't often say, yeah, it's wrong, but I want to do it anyway. They often instead say things like, well, this case is special. It's not really wrong. Or everyone else is cheating on the test. It's not that bad. I know the material. I'm just bad at test taking. So I'm not really cheating. I'm really just checking my answers against my neighbors. So we can kind of know from observing other people and from being in these situations ourselves that when I want to do some immoral action, I'm way more likely to reason to the conclusion that it's in fact morally permitted because I'm like, because I want to do it. Okay. And So it's like some specific cases of this are maybe moral matters where the advised action is something difficult to do. So I ought to apologize to a friend, but it's like more uncomfortable to apologize. Maybe there's some practical matters in which performing the action is especially difficult. So a professor tells a student that she needs to change her study habits, something like that. So again, the inconclusiveness condition is more apt to be satisfied in which I'm like likely to reason to the wrong conclusion because the wrong conclusion would be like nicer for me. Okay. And finally, the situation condition. Many of these cases are ones in which there are benefits to acting now rather than later. It's better not to cheat on the test than to have to admit your mistake later. It's better to apologize now rather than wait until the friendship has been harmed by my inability to apologize. And many of these cases are also ones in which committing to a course of action is better than merely doing the requisite actions when your own reasoning justifies it. So interpersonal relationships and just sort of being a moral person are all long-term projects, and the conditions for like being a good friend and or being a morally good person are conditions over and above just doing those things like at particular times when you can reason to those be the right things to do. Okay. So given that these conditions are apt to be satisfied, that it's apt to be rational to treat an interpersonal advisor as an authority in the sense of deferring to them rather than reasoning through the matter yourself, it very likely would be a mistake to treat no one as an interpersonal advisor. So when you have an interpersonal advisor, defer to them rather than to yourself. Things generally turn out better because you don't end up in these situations in which you're reasoning to the wrong conclusion. Okay. Two more cases that I want to talk about, which are sort of typical defer to authority cases. One is, and they're both like particularly religious cases, and one has to do with deferring to a religious tradition. So many elements within a religious tradition are taken to be authoritative by practitioners of the religion. So particular texts in the Bible, the Torah, the Quran are taken to be authoritative. Maybe opinions or pronouncements of particular people are taken to be authoritative. Moses, Muhammad, the ancient sages. You disagree with one of these people, then you have to follow them rather than yourself. Maybe a religious body is taken to be authoritative. So the magisterium in Catholic Christianity or the ecumenical councils in many branches of Christianity, there's like a body that says like, here's what the doctrine is. If you disagree that this is the doctrine, then you got to take it as authoritative anyway. We could also think of the tradition itself as an authority. You can sort of think of a tradition as like a consensus with a particular history. And you might think like, I should take the tradition to be authoritative, or religious people are like supposed to take the tradition to be authoritative in the sense that when they disagree with it, they should nonetheless believe what it says or nonetheless act in accordance with what it says. Okay. So in all of these cases, the relevant authority is supposed to supersede your own judgments. If the authority says X, then you're supposed to believe X, even if X doesn't seem true on the basis of your own reasoning. If the authority says to A and not to B, then you should A and you should B, even if A seems wrong or if B seems harmless or if B seems better when you think about it yourself. Okay. So you might worry that these like cases of tradition are going to be particularly hard to meet the conditions. Because in the case of religious traditions, there are no unanimously recognized experts, right? If there'd be like one religion instead of like lots of religions. And there are no objective track records. So we can't say like, we can't, put Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad here and say like, which things did each of these guys get right? Because there's no sort of like prior objective thing we can all agree on about which opinions are right. So you might think it's like particularly hard to meet condition 1 in these cases. Nonetheless, I do want to make the case that many individuals can be rational in taking one of these sources as authoritative. In other words, that the conditions for the rationality of faith in some religious authority are often met for particular individuals. So that doesn't mean here's an argument that we should all assign high credence to this religious authority. Instead, it's an argument that, there's some particular guy, Fred is rational to assign high credence to this particular authority having good pronouncements. So here are some of the different ways we might do that. First, Fred might just be swayed and not irrationally so by the sort of ordinary arguments and evidence for the truth of some particular religious tradition. Like Fred might be like rationally assigned high credence to this tradition on the basis of like philosophical arguments for God's existence or for this particular tradition. Second, the tradition might be popular among people that Fred considers to be good at tracking truth. So Fred might have this kind of like secondhand or indirect evidence that he should assign high credence to the truth of the claim of the tradition. Third, Fred might investigate the track record of the authoritative entity in particular and find that it fits with what he antecedently thinks is correct. For example, upon investigating the Bible, Fred might hold that it has a good track record of declaring important moral truths. The Bible seems to get it right, and seems to get it right maybe like particularly in matters that like I wasn't sure about and then became sure about. Okay, so these are ways in which Fred might come to rationally meet the first condition, the reliability condition. Second, I call this like the argument not from nowhere. Fred might rationally assign high credence to the pronouncements of the tradition he grew up in for a couple of reasons. First, it's often the case that others in his life defer to this particular tradition, just as they defer to intellectual authorities. So Fred's parents, peers, etc., deferred to scientific authorities, and Fred sees that like scientific authorities are right. They also defer to religious authorities. So it seems like these guys have a good track record of deferring to the right people. So Fred, can defer to them too. Secondly, Fred's own history with that authority or tradition can provide a high credence from the point of view. This is like not from nowhere. So from the point of view of what he already takes to be correct, that you can see that the authorities of that tradition typically do have a good track record on saying things. Finally, we might just adopt a picture on which one has no choice to think that somebody is truth tracking in a domain. That's how anybody learns anything about the world. So just as I sort of like have to come out of the room having high credence in my parents' pronouncements, otherwise I'd just simply be unable to like find anyone to teach me anything. You might sort of think a similar thing holds with respect to religious authority. Okay. These are all just sort of like suggestions for why we might think Fred is rational to meet conditions 1 and conditions 2 with respect to his tradition, even if we don't all meet those conditions with respect to his tradition. Okay. So we can sort of think of deference to a religious authority along the lines of deference by a novice to an expert. The novice initially defers to the expert, then continues to both defer and learn from the expert, unless he has low credence in the expert's pronouncement, unless he's like starts to amass evidence to the contrary. And this is sort of like typically what like deconversion or conversion to a different religious tradition might look like. So I first sort of like see that these authorities seem to have a good track record. I then put my faith in them. I trust them. I continue to do so even if I get evidence to the contrary. But if like I amass a lot of evidence, these guys are just like wrong on a lot of things, then I might stop trusting. Okay. And finally, we often meet the situation condition here. So religious matters and moral matters are often matters about which it's typically better to act now rather than later, and there might be benefits to committing to believe rather than to remaining active. Okay. I know I'm almost a little past out of time, but let me just mention the final case, and that's the case of faith in God. And I want to claim that central stories in some of the classic religious traditions of testimonial deference, faith in God, satisfy the conditions for the rationality of faith. So this is just like taking these stories at face value. Like if we assume the conditions in the stories are met, then given those conditions, the individuals satisfy the rationality conditions for deferring to God. Typical stories of testimonial deference faith in God involve God telling a person something or God telling a person to do something. So God tells Noah to build an ark. God tells Abraham that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars. God tells Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. God tells Moses to lead his people out of Egypt, etc. If we evaluate these stories on their own terms, then the reliability condition is satisfied. The recipient of the testimony typically has a track record of interacting with God or the being they take to be God. We don't want the reliability condition to just be satisfied by definition, because anyone who is in fact God should have probably like one of saying like true things. So we can either think of the question as like, is this person really God, or is this guy, call him God, really reliable? So the recipient of the testimony sometimes has a track record of interacting with this person before taking God's pronouncements on things. Other times the occurrences are accompanied by miraculous occurrences that should raise the recipient's praises. Similarly, for the inconclusiveness condition, in each story, the recipient typically has some reason to think that God's pronouncement is wrong. Noah doesn't need to build an ark, doesn't look like rain. Abraham is too old to have children. Doesn't look like Moses is going to successfully lead his people out of Egypt. But nonetheless, God's high track record should sort of weigh against the recipient, such that the recipient is sort of like genuinely unsure about what's true. Okay. And I just want to finally note the application to a particular argument. So there's this challenge that comes from James Rachel's. It's like centered around the idea of worship, but it doesn't really have to be framed in those terms. The rough challenge is this: worship requires like ceding your autonomy to someone else. It requires following someone else's commands without question. No being could be worthy of worship because you should never do that. You should never cede your autonomy to another being. Therefore, no being can be God. So if there's no thing such that you ought to cede your autonomy to it or ought to let it make your decisions for you, then there can be no thing such as God, because God is supposed to be a being to whom one could cede one decision. Okay. So we can use the work here to reply to this challenge, because we can now see when and why it can actually be better to do something commanded by someone else, even when your own reasoning indicates that doing it would be wrong, or to refrain from doing something prohibited by someone else, even when one's own reasoning indicates that doing it would not be wrong. So if we take a potential authority to have a good track record of commanding things, and if we're in a case in which we're likely to be wrong about what we should do, then there are going to be benefits to committing to doing or refraining from the action that the potential authority tells us to do, rather than deferring to our own reason. We're going to do better in terms of performing the right actions by deferring to the authority rather than to our own reason. And especially if we keep in mind that maintaining this deference isn't absolute, that there are ways to lose your faith in an authority, then we might say that an individual doesn't problematically cede her autonomy, but instead defers to an authority because, in her judgment, doing so is apt to conduce to her being a good moral agent. Okay, so just to briefly summarize what I've done, I've explained my risky commitment account of faith and when and why such faith is rational. I've shown that it applies not just to risky actions, but to belief itself, which is a risky action. I've then shown that a popular account of faith, the testimonial deference account of faith, is in fact just a special case of my risky commitment account. And then I've used the account to explain when and why it's rational to defer to someone else rather than to rely on your own reasoning. And I've shown that in 4 cases in which people typically do this or are typically counseled or suggested to do this, they tend to meet the 3 conditions. So it is in fact rational to defer to testimony. And one upshot is that deferring to testimony isn't just taking in evidence, one evidence being what this guy says. Instead, it's something special. It's saying I commit to doing what you said or to believing what you believe, regardless of what I think of it. All right. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you for a very thought-provoking talk. We're going to take a 3-minute break, and then we'll reconvene for Q&A, and that will be followed at 6 by a reception in this room. The hands are already going up.
All right.
Started.
Ah. All right, don't all refute me at once. Refute me one at a time.
Okay, so we'll start up. So my understanding is that there's something that we're going to use as a hand-held mic. And so what we'll do is pass this to the person who's asking the question. That will then amplify their voice in the room, which will enable it to be picked up on the mic that's then connected to Zoom.
Are there people on Zoom that want to ask questions too? Is that
Yes, and you're monitoring the Zoom chat. Yeah, so let me know if somebody on Zoom has a question. And we will start with Doug.
Thanks. So let me know if I'm too loud. So I want to go way back to the beginning, to your initial characterization, to your initial constraint on what faith can and cannot be, what we can and cannot have faith.
Okay.
Doug?
Yeah.
You may need to actually.
Oh, okay. I gotta put it in my face.
I can repeat questions too if that's helpful.
Is this
Okay.
we're good? Okay. So you've given the example of say not being able to have faith that someone's gonna not quit smoking.
Mhm.
Given that you think that's not a good thing. What I'm wondering about is that there seem to be other examples where people have faith in propositions that they don't think are good. Like many religious people seem to have that I take it have faith that Satan exists or that a fall occurred in the Garden of Eden or yada yada yada.
Yeah.
So what do you think about these sorts of cases? I mean, it just strikes me that I'm not saying there's any kind of serious problem. It strikes me that it would seem like it would be natural to have an account on which something counts as an appropriate target of faith, just in case one either thinks that that proposition is or would be good, and then have a disjunction and say, or this proposition is one that one believes on the basis of one's belief in some proposition that one thinks is good. And so then you have this inductive structure, in which you have this base case, and then all the others are constructed out of it. But anyway, then I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Maybe you think these examples just aren't any issue at all.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's a good proposal. I think that's a way you could go, and that would accommodate the idea that, like, you know, the Christian has faith that Satan exists. I think I'm inclined to say something like pretty similar to what you said, but such that it actually doesn't count that the Christian has faith that Satan exists. So I think, yeah, so I mean, I'm curious what people think. Like, I hear that datum as like, that's maybe not something you would hear a religious person say. Like, and the reason is that faith, I think faith isn't quite the right attitude towards that claim. So it's not the case that you have, that the religious person has faith in all claims that follow from the religion. And so one kind of example is this thing that, like, you maybe wish it weren't true or whatever. And another kind of example might be things that you are willing to gather evidence about. For example, like, the religious person maybe has faith that she should give money to the poor, but she wants to gather evidence about the right way to do that. So there are these, like, it's not just the case that any claims that fall within the religious domain end up being objects of faith. Instead, I want to say certain things, maybe certain like core things, are objects of faith, and then other things follow from them. So those are might be objects of mere belief. And so that's actually sort of similar to your proposal, like that something counts as faith if you believe it on the basis of one's belief that one thinks is good. I sort of think like something counts as like maybe religious if you believe it on the basis of something you have religious faith in, but it's not necessarily an object of faith. So I would go, yeah, so that I would go slightly differently. However, like, I think if somebody disagreed with me and said, like, no, actually religious people do have faith that Satan exists, faith that, you know, XYZ, then I like your strategy for accommodating.
Yeah, I mean, I know that other people, there's probably a long queue. Could I just ask a brief, quick follow-up? So can I just try one more case rather than the same case? I guess another one that occurred to me is, you know, stuff like a religious person having faith, especially a religious Catholic, having faith that Catherine was torn apart on her wheel. It seems like that's, at least it seems like they would use the locution, I think, that I have faith. Why do I believe that? Well, I have faith that Catherine was torn apart on her wheel. But I take it maybe there's like, maybe a way of characterizing the kind of proposal that you're making to analyze those. Would it be fair to say maybe there's just, we should make a distinction between, you know, the locution believing on the basis of faith, that's merely a way of speaking, at least some of the time.
Yeah.
And actually having faith in proposition's truth.
Yeah, I think you could say that. I also might want to problematize this Catherine example too, because I think you could say that there is a point of view from which it's good, I guess. And I think it might be that somebody is thinking about that when they have faith. So, like, you know, faith that Jesus descended into hell. Like, on the one hand, that's really bad. On the other hand, that's really good. And I think it might be that they're going with the good part of that. But yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks for the examples.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your talk. Really, sorry, thank you. Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, Jack.
I was wondering if there are, so you mentioned how we can make a risk commitment, but we could still revise our risk commitment if it meets some kind of threshold. I wonder if there's scenarios where the person who prefers the testimony account is going to say, like, it's given like a person who adopts a super low threshold, like they're only going to revise under these extreme conditions. That seems a bit irrational, like intuitively. But like if you take again, like using examples from Jewish scriptures that you were like Moses, like Abraham and Isaac, that's an extreme situation where it's like, wow, how did he not revise his threshold? Right. And but his testimony, or you have Job, like he didn't revise his threshold. So where this low threshold seems irrational, but for that tradition, it would seem rational because the testimony principle.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Good. Yeah, so I mean, I still think we could think about those in terms of, you know, the threshold is how low your credence gets is going to depend on other facts about your evidential situation. So in the case of Abraham, he might say like, God said this crazy thing, but you know, I really have this long history of interacting with God, and God is always right. So it might be that his credence shouldn't drop super low or something like that. It also might be that yeah, sorry. So that's one thing to possibly say. I guess, I mean, maybe the overall point is that like there's sort of two questions here, and one is like, is this a place where my account and the testimony account come apart? And the other question is like, you know, should Abraham have dropped his faith, or Job or something like that? I think in the answer to the first question, the two accounts don't come apart, because if the testimony account person says no because testimony, then I can sort of interpret that in terms of my account. And then the second question, like, you know, which I kind of take to be, well, like, aren't there cases in which like the faith was really irrational? Thinking about these biblical stories. And I guess, yeah, I guess I'm sort of committed to thinking that it was rational, but that it sounds sort of fantastical because we're not in the same evidential situation as these people, and so it would be really irrational for me to like, you know, say like, hey, this voice was like, sacrifice your son. Okay, like that would be a bad idea for me because I don't have that track record of interacting with this guy. Maybe for some particular person, if her life went sufficiently badly as Job's life, it would make sense for her to give up her faith in God because she doesn't have this track record. Yeah, it's a good question. I think I have to think a little bit more.
If I can follow up on that, if we go that route, where does that put us when in our current circumstances?
Yeah.
We're evaluating each other's grievances. If we allow for those instances, what's the story for us in the contemporary context?
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could say like the moral is like the religious novice shouldn't be engaging in these fantastical behaviors. So it would be a bad idea to be like a fanatic or a zealot if you're new to a religion, because you maybe don't have the track record of evidence, unless you had some kind of thing where it's like, it gives you credence one, like, you know, person rising from the dead right in front of you, whatever, like that, you know, but like in general, just on the basis of sort of like interacting with the tradition, you shouldn't become a fanatic on the basis of that. It might be that longer term, after engaging in a religion for a really long time, it does become rational to be a fanatic. I think that's like the upshot of what I'm saying here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'll try to be brief since there's a long queue. I have a question about your probability assessments that you're making use of, and I'll just stick specifically with the testimonial deference case. So you say the probability of X given that A testifies that X is sufficiently high to satisfy the reliability condition. How are we to think of the probability? Is it subjective probability or objective probability?
Great question. So it's subjective probability, which is why it could be different for everybody. But so there are two ways that people think about subjective probability, or two ways people think about what makes subjective probability rational. The more permissive people think that it just has to be like consistent with itself. So as long as you're like probability of X plus probability of not X equals 1, you're good. I mean, they're a little more complicated than that, but it's like basically just consistency. The stronger way to think about the rationality of subjective probability is that it also has to obey some sort of constraints about like fit to evidence. So, you know, it's in fact, so like they come apart in the sense of like, by the first definition, a conspiracy theorist could totally count as rational. Because, like, you know, you give them a piece of evidence, they have an explanation, but they're totally consistent. They have an explanation for how it fits into their conspiracy, but they're not rational in the second definition. So I tend to hold the second definition. It's the rationality of subjective probability isn't just consistency, it's like something stronger than the others.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Sharon.
So, there are more technical questions that I could ask if I get around to say another time, or other people will ask you at dinner or something. But I wanted to start, like, I thought it might be useful to start with to ask a big picture question about this the value of
Commitment,
to
yeah.
believe, as opposed to as opposed to letting your credence like fluctuate, like, as more evidence comes in, and like some like kind of concrete like examples of how you might be thinking about that in different core cases of interest. So like here's like one way of putting pressure on, like, so you might think, so what would you say to someone that says, I can see the value of being able to committing to action, of being able to right, as I say in economic terms, take a commitment pill. That can help you negotiate better. You can convince your negotiating partner that you really won't accept less than X amount, like even if it would be beneficial to both of you. That's and it helps you be a better friend if you can convince your friend that even if like their request seems totally silly and pointless to you, you'll still honor it. Even if you're totally over their friendship, like 10 years later, you still won't like tell their secrets, even if you have a right. So I get that. It might be valuable to have that decision to commit to actions, right? And maybe to like, commit to like following commandments, not just as like 600 Moses and 613, like weird tricks, weird life hacks that like turn out like often to like make your life go well. Hey, they worked out pretty cool so far, and it's fun, I guess I will, but a different way. Okay, but something distinct, you're distinctively defending commitment to believe. And just to make it provocative, here's an argument that commitment to believe is like kind of actively bad and is in tension with something that you would want, a religious person would want, which is your classic soul making veil of soul making answers to the problem of evil. So I think, what's the point of all this bad stuff going along, right? Basically in this, it's like that we're able to like make meaningful choices, right? So there are some propositions like that righteousness will be rewarded in the long end, that in the wrong, that death is an illusion, these sort of things that if they're true and you were to begin to suspect they were true, it would actually be pretty bad for you to assign probability 1 to them. You wouldn't be getting the treatment, you wouldn't be getting the value out of living in a fallen world at all. You'd be just like skipping over to the whole thing, you'd be like defeating the purpose if you were fully confident in that, rather than going up and down Jacob's ladder or whatever of like more confidence versus less confidence in that. I mean, I think even in the Christian tradition, there's stuff about like, when someone looks out over a dead world and says like, why have you forsaken me, God, and still obeys ignorance? Like that's what's the value. So obviously this isn't about all proposition C, but like the challenge is, what would you say to someone? What are some maybe cases that it's actually good to like maintain very high confidence in like the classic like theological propositions that.
Good. Actually, those are the central kinds of cases that I want to defend. And I think one thing I want to clarify is that when I'm talking about commitment, I don't mean set your credence 1. When I say commitment, I mean something like believe regardless of what your credence is. And so I think like that's sort of like, the proponent of the soul-making theodicy then would say something like the thing that's soul-making is like committing, even though sometimes I'm in doubt. Or the other, what was the other example? The second example?
Yeah, I mean that's fine. But I mean, it's not like you might have thought what was valuable would be to believe that like your life was the only one that you had, and then to like sacrifice or gravely risk that to like honor God, right? To believe that like you actually would like these children that like Joe was gonna go, they're actually not, they're not gonna like wake up again, right? You genuinely are sacrificing something that genuinely will not be given back. You genuinely are sacrificing something for righteousness. Okay, and yours that is. So I'm thinking you need to believe it, like that's part of the like soul making effect is like, believing that you're making a genuine sacrifice. And yours, yeah, okay, so I really shouldn't have said credence. I'm sorry, I think especially in this context, that was confusing, but so if we do it in terms of belief, I guess you're saying, like, no, it's sort of sufficient for the soul making, to believe that everything will seemingly sacrificing all of this stuff, like will actually work out to be like that positive in the end, in the face of evidence otherwise.
Yeah,
Whereas
yeah,
I might not need that evidence to act on you and cause the belief that like, oh crap, I really am losing all this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, I might not be like so deeply familiar with the soul making theodicy. I might be getting.
It's so embarrassing. We're using the wrong argument, common people be like, there's a class of God,
No, I mean, I've heard the term. I'm just. Yeah,
it's not. I think it's not.
I think the right.
It is.
word.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
the details. If the details of the account matter, then I'm not
Okay.
like. But yeah, whatever the thing is that's supposed to be the object, you're doing something in the face of evidence to the contrary is like the good thing. What I'm saying that something is like committing to act or acting or believing in the face of evidence to the contrary. So I'm like and it might not. So I'm like believing that all will be well, even though it doesn't look that way. Or I'm believing that like this thing will turn out good in the end.
Just to quickly restate that, right? And then I'll give away power. It's like too much power for a person to have the microphone themselves and have to give it up voluntarily. But so I'm like, from believing that there would be a genuine sacrifice that, like, righteousness would make it up in the end, and I'm like sacrificing it because that's what's required. That's what righteousness requires. And there you get the like soul making power and character forming to like decide what you're going to do in that case. Oh crap! Like righteousness requires something. You require a terrible sacrifice on that. And I think you're saying to me, like, that's not necessarily how you have to, like, that's not the only way of thinking about the meaningful choices that this like terrible world is like facing us with.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be that you're knowingly making a sacrifice or making what you believe is a sacrifice. You could believe that in the infinite run it isn't a sacrifice, but there's still a sort of active character and believing that in the face of apparently fairly strong, like, or some evidence. Again, some evidence that like, you're pretty much just like losing out on your chance to have a fun life, and like that's all there is.
Yeah, I see. I mean, I see. I think if you went that way, probably the thing that you would want to have faith in is like that I ought to make this sacrifice or something, rather than that. In fact, this isn't a sacrifice. Like I can't see why this, in fact, isn't a sacrifice. Would be like a good object of faith. It's like this is the right thing, nonetheless.
Okay.
I gotta do this or something, or yeah.
Matthew Hoffman, and I think no, sorry.
Sorry.
Yeah, and it is 5:35, so I think I'm going to ask people to limit follow-ups a little bit.
Thanks for the talk, very interesting.
Thanks.
So I'm interested in how questioning this to me seems to pull apart from the issue of whether or not I take the religious tradition or God to be authoritative. In particular, since we're talking about Abraham and Isaac, there's a long-standing tradition in Judaism that says, no, Abraham did the wrong thing. He should have questioned God. Should have done so because he did Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah.
Questioning isn't failing to take God to be authoritative, in particular because God doesn't get to micromanage. And more generally, because I'm Jewish, questioning is the tradition. I'm not failing to believe in the right sort of way, in the right sort of things, if I'm asking why is this the way this
Right.
questioning and
Yeah.
It seems like there's a particular way of that faith just doesn't seem to capture my relation to religious authority nor to God.
Well, I think there's a way to question someone or something while treating that thing as an authority, and there's a way to question them while not. So think about the way like a child, debates with a parent, like, no, you can't go out on Friday night. Like, oh no, but here are my reasons why I want to go out. Like, please, mom, no, you can't go out. Here's, et cetera. Like that's a kind of questioning where the child is treating the parent as authoritative because the parent has the final word. And similarly, I'm not saying that like faith requires not doing that. It's like faith in God requires like treating God as the final word, even if you're not sort of like all the way satisfied. The alternative to that would be like, the parent case, mom says I'm not going out on Friday night, but I go out anyway. That's like not treating the parent as an authority. Or God says, sacrifice Isaac, or I'm gonna destroy Sodom, but and Abraham says, no, you won't, instead of like, what if I can find a righteous guy? So I do think that I think that example is sort of similar to the example I mentioned of the apologist who's like believes in God, but nonetheless like wants to like look at the evidence so that they can convince other people. They're committed and looking for the evidence is like part of them trying to do like the thing they want to do, but still they don't let their commitment depend on the evidence. I think similarly and you can tell me whether this like sort of squares with the tradition you're thinking about from your point of view. Being committed to God, but questioning him is like a way to have faith in my sense, because you're treating him as an authority and treating his final pronouncement, whatever he lands, that's where I'm going. I'm not going to say, no, I repudiate you, God. Yeah, that's the thought.
I mean, I'll pass this along, but in fact, no, God is not the final authority. Final authority is the Torah.
Okay, well, but then that just means that the correct object of faith is the Torah. Right, so that's just a tradition of God is. What you say? But what that means is that's a tradition according to which God isn't. It's not that my definition of faith is incorrect. It's that in that tradition, God is not the object of faith or authority. The Torah is.
Yeah, then
Right.
Then worship.
Right. Well, that's why I said Rachel's formulates this in terms of worship, but it really doesn't need to be. It's really about authority. So yeah, absolutely, that's when worship and faith.
Thank you. I got stuck very early.
Okay.
Right, this is the right ground floor question. About talking about, I think it's believing as an action.
Mhm.
And so notions of commitment come into play. And
Yeah.
Some like the way they unproblematically come into play with action, courses of action. And this is an invitation to say a little more about that. I wasn't clear then if the faith you were describing was a kind of belief and a believing, as you said, or how it's distinguishable from, say, pretending to believe, the maintaining of a pretense. And that can involve how you direct your attention and how you seek evidence and things that are relevant to belief. But believing but the believing itself is not the object of commitment. It is self-manipulation, pretense, the same capacities deployed in forms of self-deception. So one example here, and I won't have a follow-up with this because I'm trying to short it. So Kant gives this example in the canon of first critique as an example of faith. a doctor's faced with a patient. Patient is either suffering from, I'll just say, cancer or tuberculosis. Both are possibilities, but only the tuberculosis is treatable. If it's cancer, can't do anything about it, can't even ameliorate it. So he proceeds in that, on the working assumption that it's tuberculosis, these are the treatments, these are the things, not because that's in any way sensitive to the evidence, right? But because, look, if it's cancer, then can do nothing.
Yeah.
So he acts as if, is he acting with faith in your sense?
Good question. So would he be, if he got evidence that it was cancer, he would ignore it, I guess. I mean, that it was a non-treatable cancer. It's like, so he's not looking for further,
He'd ignore it,
That's interesting. So it's the reasons he's doing it, his reasons for doing it don't meet the structure of the rationality of faith that I'm talking about here. And that's because there's sort of like, in a sense, it isn't a risk, like there isn't a negative payoff to him believing that it's tuberculosis when it's not. So you're just describing the case where, like, no matter what it is, it's actually better to believe that it's tuberculosis. So that's not really that's not really a risk unless so.
Did I add a little risk then?
Well, if you could add a little
It would
risk,
get in the way of some minor palliative care, although nothing.
well, but then it might be better to look. So add in such the right way that it's like not actually better to look for evidence. Then it would be. Then yeah, I think it would be. Well, you'd really have to just. I mean, you'd have to like the inconclusiveness condition is like slightly hard to meet. So it'd have to be in a situation in which like there's like misleading evidence around that it's like. But yeah, I think from what you described, I think that would count as faith. But though it's not sort of the sort of central case that I'm talking about is one in which it's like genuine. It's like really good to X if thing is true, it's really bad to X if thing is false. So it might trivially count as faith, but I guess that's a minor risk. So I noted that faith comes in degrees. So that's going to count as like a very little degree of faith. And we might think that like that just doesn't track what we call faith or what we think is true.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Here.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really interesting talk. So I really like the testimonial deference account of faith as an account of what faith is. But I kept thinking about certain disanalogies between the mundane cases, like having faith in what my physics professor says, or what my doctor says, or what my carpenter says, and on the one hand, and then having religious faith. And so to my mind, the disanalogy comes down to how this authority that I'm deferring to has acquired their credence. So in the case of the physics professor, they have spent years and years studying physics. The carpenter has a lot of experience building cupboards. My doctor has gone to medical school for 10 years and so on. But in the religious case, it's often like a vision or some supernatural occurrence that someone experiences. And that seems to be a big difference. I'm kind of inclined to say that the difference amounts to my physics professor having knowledge and certain religious authorities having mere faith. And so the difference is deferring to a claim that's based on knowledge versus deferring to a claim that's based on faith. But maybe you would say that religious authorities also have knowledge. So
I would say that the dynamics of the cases are similar. There's an exception that I'll talk about, but I think the dynamics of the cases are similar. I think in general, the kind of religious authorities that people actually follow came to be religious authorities through training and track record. And also in general, the physics professors have not been like studying the direct objects of physics. They haven't been like, themselves reperforming every physics experiment, but instead have like gotten their knowledge through a testimonial chain. So I actually think the case in which the religious authority is followed because they've had like a vision or an experience is the exception. It might just be a case in which I don't think all cases of religious faith are rational. I think they can be rational if they meet these conditions. So if you describe the case in the right way, I might call it irrational. Now, I do think, as I mentioned, there is a significant difference, which is that there tends to be two differences. One is that there tends to be a lot more convergence on, a lot more agreement in the case of physics. Maybe not these new theories of like, string theory versus the other thing, but in the sort of case of like the vast body of knowledge, most physics professors agree about, F equals ma in a vacuum or whatever, and the other difference being that, they're both making empirical claims. It's just sort of like a lot easier to replicate the testing empirical claims in this case. So, and I do think those differences matter. I think it's probably going to be easier to end up with rational faith in your physics professor. I think probably anybody who just shows up in a university class labeled physics automatically gets to count as having rational faith in their physics professor, whereas it's not the case that anybody that just shows up in a building labeled church has rational faith. So yeah, I do think it's going to be harder to meet the conditions because of these differences, but I think they're more similar than you might be initially inclined to think, and also they both like can meet the conditions.
Those who still have questions, put your hands up. Kirk, did you have a question?
I'm gonna pass.
Okay. Yeah, we have.
And I'm going to dinner, so put me at the end.
But well, it's something.
Yeah.
I mean, we all might like to hear those questions, so I'll ask you a question.
Okay. Yeah, that's the audience.
Okay. Yeah, so here's what we're going to do. Lara has agreed that she's willing to take questions for an extra 5 minutes. At 6 o'clock, we're going to stop. Anybody who needs to leave, is free to leave at that point. And then those who want to stay and hear a few more questions, we'll do that for 5 minutes, and then we'll have the reception. So, hands up, please. So Andrew, John, Katie, and Tim. Okay, Katie Anderson.
Hi, so I'm gonna try and get this out quickly, given the time. So I'm gonna try to get this out quickly. I hope it's comprehensive.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit worried that the situation condition is rationally self-undermining. In a way that specifically has to do with, we'll put this to mind as your own remarks about motivated reasoning. So let's suppose that the conditions are met. So benefits here is a comparative term, right? So at a certain moment, there are benefits to be had that I reasonably judge to be had by adopting this commitment to believing whatever in the face of a certain amount of counter evidence. That's conditioned on it not being some other amount of counter evidence that would make it not rational to have the commitment. Yeah, so far
Sorry, let's say this a second again.
So the rationality of this is that I believe that the benefits here of continuing to believe, in the face of a certain amount of counter evidence, warrant adopting a commitment, where that's taking for granted that there's some amount of evidence that would warrant abandoning the commitment.
Yeah, although the benefits specifically are just benefits to believing if it's true. If it's when you're talking about like the C in the condition.
Okay. Okay, but so I'm worried that the commitment itself, continuing to believe in the face of counter evidence, changes the incentive structure in such a way that motivated reasoning, such that I'm never going to see, right, you were right to point out that motivated reasoning motivates what we believe, what we see as evidence.
Yeah.
Right, having made this commitment, the concern is that once you've made it, you won't see the counter evidence that would be sufficient to abandon it. Precisely because that's the nature of the commitment. Because you want it to be true. And because the benefits, right, because you want it to be true, and the longer you believe it in the face of a certain amount of counter evidence, you know, in for a dime, in for a dollar, right?
Yeah, good. I mean, I do think, so one thing, so there's this phenomenon of like conservatism and belief, like people hold on to their beliefs longer than, you know, the evidence might suggest. And what I'm doing is partially just like defending that phenomenon. So I think to a certain extent, like, so what a commitment does is it makes your beliefs stay. And I think, you know, you hold on to them for, you know, a long time, even if, you know, sort of viewed from nowhere situation, it wouldn't be rational to believe this thing. So motivated reasoning might actually be part of it. It might be that commitment partly operates by my, like, not, you know, so committed to my scientific theory that the sun revolves around the earth. And so like when I see this evidence about the trajectory of Venus, I go epicycles. That's like, you can think of that as a kind of, I'm motivated to save my theory. Or when I'm a religious person and I'm confronted with the problem of evil, I like come up with these theodicies or something. So I actually do think that is a function of commitment. And I think it's like two things to keep in, so I'm defending it. And two things to keep in mind. One is that I don't think it's gonna keep you in forever. So if you do get, you know, we did one epicycle of Venus, now we're doing 5 of them, and now I'm like, this thing isn't gonna work. Second thing to keep in mind, I do have high credence in the thing to begin with. So that's different from the case in which I'm like motivatedly reasoning that I should cheat on the test, because I didn't have any reason to want to like commit to thinking I should, you know, I never thought cheating on the test was a good idea. I'm in this situation which I'm tempted, so I don't want to like keep believing I'm cheating on the test. But when these conditions are met, it is rational to like, you know, call it motivated reasoning. You can also call it like, you know, defense of my hypothesis, or reasoning that like spurs me on my commitment. So I am like, you know, but in the starkest terms, I'm defending motivated reasoning in these cases where you like are already committed to it. I'm saying that's good. Why is that good? Because it like, in the case in which evidence is like bounces around, the only way I'm going to stick with my hypothesis is to like defend it when the chips are down.
I'm so dying to ask a follow-up, and I won't. Evidence dictates.
In a way, my question could follow on that. I mean, I think the concern that she was raising that I don't know that you fully addressed was that the faith commitment might screen the person off from looking at relevant evidence. It's not just that so, you know, I was thinking when I'm looking at your page 2, the top of your conditions, that it's kind of schematic, and I'm thinking, you know, the devil's in the detail here.
Yeah.
Significant evidence in clause 1,
Right.
sufficiently high in clause 2. And I thought, you know, absent a pretty strong constraint on condition 1, when the first judge that it's sufficiently high, where say, you know, you might require that one rationally believes that the evidence that one has already canvassed is sufficiently representative and you know, a significant base of evidence. If we don't have a constraint like that, then it's going to be highly dependent on the evidence that one is first exposed to. So we can compare it. religious Regina and irreligious Ian, who started off with different bodies of evidence that yeah, they wasn't represented, and then they're systematically not listening to other evidence and taking themselves to be doing so reasonably. So even if they encounter an argument, they say, well, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure there's a good answer to that, you know, because the initial sources that I was going on, they seem to have good answers in general.
Good, yeah. So, I mean, that stuff is actually gonna fit into condition 2. So it's that, I mean, I think I spent more time talking about condition 1, but it's like, it's harder to meet condition 2. So, and just like, here's a way of thinking about it. Like, I can meet condition 1 by like, so consider probability of heads. Let's say I flip a coin 10 times and it comes up heads each time. Maybe I meet condition 1. But I'm not going to meet condition 2 because any like additional toss of heads, because I have so few instances of it, is going to be able to like lower my credence. Whereas if I flip a coin 10,000 times and it's heads, the probability that I can say that the probability that it'll come up heads on the next flip is pretty high. And also the probability that it'll come up heads, given most additional string of coin flips, will be sufficiently high. So, and I want to say something similar in the case of like whether I canvassed all the evidence. So if I just like have, or whether I've been exposed to a sufficient body of the evidence. So if I think I haven't been exposed to like a representative sample of the evidence, then for most values of E, condition 2 is not going to be met because my probability given this other evidential source says something could drop down significantly. I mean, as you said, the details of the case are going to matter. And I suppose there is this worry related to what you said, that like the person kind of like thinks or the person takes themselves to have been exposed to a lot of evidence, but that's just false. So that's sort of maybe the answer to that sort of goes into your question about like objective versus, or like what are the constraints? And I want to say like the constraints are, it's not just consistency. So that person's not going to count as rational. You're not going to meet these conditions just because you're like, yeah, I've looked at I've looked at enough evidence or whatever.
Okay, we are at 6 o'clock. Let's thank our speaker for the first time. Anybody needs to leave, take 30 seconds, something like that happen, and then we'll have, I guess it's an encore.
All right.
Okay. So let's see, we have John Anderson.
I happen to be holding the microphone. So this is mostly just an invitation to get a little bit more clarity on what exactly commitment.
Yeah.
There are often things about benefits of commitment. I'm just trying to figure it out because sometimes it sounded like it was about ignoring incoming negative evidence, and at other times it was continuing to believe even in the face of it.
Okay, good.
And those seem important.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, you were mentioning the grad school case, like what would it look like to not have this like commitment?
Yeah.
You'd be like constantly changing your mind. And I was thinking,
Yeah.
well, not necessarily, right? I mean, so incoming without having full blown, well, it depends on how we're understanding commitment, but the way I think of it, without having faith or full blown commitment, right? Incoming negative evidence can come in and you say, well, that's some amount of negative evidence, but across my wider body of evidence, I still have reason to continue believing that I'll succeed or whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
So I was trying to
Yeah. So I am thinking that you intake new evidence, but the way you intake new evidence is that it changes your credences. Credences are like roughly a measure of how likely you think the thing is given the evidence. So like new evidence comes in, the add thing is less likely. But when you, but what you commit to has to do with respect to belief or action. So you like let your action swing free of your credence. You say, no matter what credence I have, still going to do this action. And similarly, in the case of belief, you so to speak, you close your mind, close the inquiry. You're like, all right, I believe this thing. Maybe additional evidence will come in, and that will change what I think is its likelihood on the evidence. But I'm not going to like reevaluate. That's like the thing I'm committed to. So maybe in the grad school case, oh man, I failed this paper. What I'm committed to is not like reevaluating, should I really be here? Or believing that I'm like, but reevaluating the belief that I should be.
Well, I follow up.
So there's no one left on Zoom, so you don't need to use a mic. Okay. And there were no Zoom questions? No. Okay. Okay. I think so. Andrew, it's the last, well, all right, not quite the last word, but the last question.
No, I get the last word. So, I was just wondering, I had a thought that maybe there are cases of meeting the risky commitment faith account that don't involve the testimonial deference account that wouldn't fit it.
Yeah.
Because I'm worried that you could fit the risky commitment account, not because you believe the authority's testimony, but because you believe you meet the 3 conditions. So it seems to me that I'm basing my belief on the fact that I meet these 3 conditions and know these conditions hold. And therefore, it doesn't seem that I'm believing it because I believe the person. Oh, why do I believe this person? Well, because, my credence that what they say is true is really high. And, I don't have enough counter evidence against it, right? And the situation is blah, 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 right? And it seems that's the reason I believe it, not like just because they told me. Now, I don't know if this is relevant to the kind of the way you're thinking about this on the basis of authority's testimony here, giving the account. I guess that's what I'm asking about. Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, good. Yeah, good question. I guess I'm thinking, so I mean, I'm telling a story about there's this like what you do, and then there's this like what makes it rationally justified. And you're kind of saying, well, couldn't I do the thing because I'm rationally justified, and that like undermines kind of meaning.
It seems like there could be cases of that, like a person really thinks through the conditions. It's like, oh,
Yeah, good. I mean, I think I probably have to think a little bit more about this. I mean, I haven't said anything about this, like the person's motivations for having faith and how that comes into the story. And I think I have to think a little bit more about this. So like, yeah, I guess an initial answer would just be that what it is to like have faith in an authority is to if somebody says X, you go with X, regardless of the story about whether it's like you engage in this extra reasoning of going through this. I mean, in fact, I think a lot of the times you might engage in something like it. You don't calculate our credences, but this authority says something and like, all right, I trust him. Oh gosh, but like, should I think that's wrong? Yeah, but just like, gosh, this is the case in which I'm like likely to engage in motivated reasoning. I'm like not very good at judgment in this case. I should just trust the authority. So I do think we do kind of engage in something like thinking about the 3 conditions to sort of shore up our trust in the authority. And I think it still counts as trusting. I trust him because this reason, and what's sort of important to the authoritative piece is like, I treat you as an authority, not this other guy. What it is to treat you as an authority is to like, when you say A, I A. Yeah. But I have to think a little bit more because it's true in this story. There isn't like you have faith because like, blah blah blah, and you might wonder if that's a mistake.
I'm itching to ask a follow-up, but we're at the end of our time.
Thank you, guys.